10-second warning order here. One of the things I wanted to say, as I mentioned yesterday, we are going to send out a survey for some feedback, but I also put up there my email address and to give me real-time feedback. And I probably got 10 or 15 emails yesterday that were along this line. Charlie, I'm enjoying the conference, but darn it, you aren't giving us enough information how we can donate to support the... And so, I'm not under oath here, am I, Judge? So, seriously, if one of the things we like to do is obviously subsidize the attendance of the students and as well as the military personnel. And one of the things I want to do next year is we had some great students come from East Carolina, Elon, American University, and unfortunately the way it worked is that they had to pay the full bill. And what I'd like to do next year is have it for all students that we would subsidize their attendance. So if you can think of that, that would be great. Our speaker this morning is a very, very special friend of mine. And he's actually, I got to know Phil mainly through his writings. If you read his bio, he's very understated the amount of writing he's done. He's been a columnist. He's very well known in the military community. He's a Iraq War veteran. He is now at the Center for New American Security, heading up there as a senior counsel, but the director of the Military Veterans and Society program. He's going to talk to us about his perspective on civil-military relations. And I can tell you Phil knows everything about everything, and I don't say that very often. And that's certainly not the way Phil would characterize himself. I never fail to learn something from Phil because he has a way of looking at the world that is a little bit different, and when you listen to him, he really has a point. And we occasionally disagree, but not very often. And one thing I don't like about Phil is that when I disagree with him, usually at the end of the discussion, I realize he's right and I was wrong. And my students know I never like to be wrong about anything because of the way I think about myself. But actually, Phil is that kind of a person. And for his legal education, his undergrad and graduate education, he went to the University of Southern California. And we're very, very glad to have him here this morning. And if you want to read more of Phil Carter, I know if you Google him, you'll come up with, dozens and dozens of articles. The big challenge will be which subject matter do you want to read about what he has to say. Phil, without further ado.
Thank you, Charlie. And I do have to correct you on one thing. I went to UCLA, not USC, which is close to fighting words. That's like saying you're at Chapel Hill.
Gee, was that a mistake?
But thank you, and thank you also for all of your friendship and mentorship over the last several years. As some of you probably know, Charlie is one of the leading scholars in civil relations. His essay, The American Military Coup of 2012, is essentially one of the source documents you have to read before any study in this field, right up there with Huntington and others. I'm grateful we've not had a military coup. We did not have one 2 years ago. We're not likely to have one this year, but the year's still young. We're also far from seeing the kind of civil tension and friction you see in Egypt or Pakistan or China, but it's an election year. So there will be a lot this year, and there'll be more in 2016, and I fear that many of the things you wrote about are coming to fruition in various ways, and I'm going to talk about that a bit here. I think comparison with those countries, that's a very low bar for American civil-military relations. We can and should do better because of our constitutional order, our democratic traditions, and most importantly, as I look at some folks from what I'm assuming is Fort Bragg based on the airborne paraphernalia, a professionalized military that outmatches any in the world. And most discussion of civil relations tends to focus on it as kind of a large blob. It includes everything from concerns about the number of military personnel in society to how the president transmits orders to his generals or fires them when they fail to perform. I think that obscures the discussion a bit. So what I want to do today is break that into what I think are three distinct but overlapping domains. The first is what I'll describe as vertical civil-military relations. It's the relationship on the org chart between the president, the civilian-appointed leadership, and the military leadership. The second is horizontal civil-military relations, which some describe as the interagency. But if you hang out with a lot of USAID or state types, they call it CIVMil, because to them as civilians, it's how they relate to the military, and it's how we bring together civilian and military elements of power, both in Washington and the field. And the third is the civil-military divide, that broad set of societal relationships that really informs how our society relates to the military and also how we democratically make decisions about the uses of force. So first, and I'll try to move quickly because I do want to leave some time for questions. The classic study of civil-military relations relates to that first dimension, the vertical dimension. This is what Huntington wrote on. This is in some ways what Charlie has written on. This is what many others focus on because it's the most consequential. Decisions about taking the nation to war matter. I think it's useful to describe them as vertical because it suggests the org chart that we have in place. It suggests a power relationship between the parties, and it also differentiates it between the two. But in practice, it's anything but vertical. Even in the geography of the sit room, where the parties sit around an oblong table, not unlike Knights of the Round Table, what we've gone to is much more of a complex, almost a matrixed organization. Some might call it a multipolar world where you no longer just have the president and the generals, but you have the president and senior political advisors like the chief of staff, and you have a national security advisor, and you have generals, and you have not just generals, but generals of combatant commands and of services and many others. And in practice, it functions much differently from a one-way conduit. It's, and this is not unfamiliar for anyone in the military. There is really not a simple chain of command in any unit, whether you're talking about a squad or you're talking about the entire U.S. military. It's not a one-way street. It's a two-way conduit and a much richer form of communication. And Congress contemplated this when they created the various statutes that set up this relationship. They didn't look to objective control. They didn't look to, which didn't exist at the time they created the National Security Act. They didn't look to conventional understandings of order. What they built was a system that, in the National Security Act, contemplated a very complex system where civilian and military actors around the statutory National Security Council would interact. They contemplated a very aggressive role for general officers, and they carved it into their statutory job descriptions in Title X, where the chairman of the Joint Staff has the role of principal military advisor. The combatant commanders also serve advisors, and so do the service chiefs. Query whether you also want JIADO, NSA, and a lot of other actors in that mix too, but that's something that we'll talk about that points to the complexity of how this has developed over the last several years. And it illustrates how objective control, agent principle, the theory of Duke's own Peter Feaver and others, are really not explanatory anymore. We look at the decisions like the Afghanistan surge decision, which was essentially a statutory NSC process where you had a series of interagency policy committee meetings, marching into deputies, marching into principals, marching into a NSC chaired by the president, and neither Huntington nor anyone else would recognize that as consistent with what they wrote about. You had the process racked with leaks throughout. You had McChrystal's classified assessment and Eikenberry's classified cables leaked. The decision took place during the president's first year in office, but the strategy's execution occurred during the backdrop of a debate on national health care, a debate on a struggling economy, the elections of 2010 and 2012, and those all made it much more complex. None of these decisions were able to take place in a vacuum. All were very messy, all involved interests and actors, both below and above, that had a stake in the decision. And it's not clear that the decision came out in a way that satisfied anyone. If you all have read Secretary Gates' recent memoir, there's this memorable quote where he's describing the president's comments in a meeting a year and a half after the surge decision. Gates writes, "As I sit there, I thought the president doesn't trust his commander, can't stand Karzai, doesn't believe in his own strategy, and doesn't consider the war to be his. For him, it's all about getting out." And so we had what was essentially the statutory process. It was a very messy process throughout, and it results in a decision, but then that decision is undermined and carried out in ways that are not necessarily faithful to what we might imagine as a clean vertical chain of command. It's a messy process. We see this with other decisions too. The Osama bin Laden raid, and I'm sorry we don't have Steve Preston here because he was obviously part of the decision process for that. So I'd love to just read his facial expressions as I talk about it. The decision process for that reads like something out of a novel, that the CIA comes to the president, at least from what we have in reported leaks. The CIA comes to the president and says they have good intelligence that bin Laden's in this compound. They gradually spin up a process with Special Operations Command to begin the planning and execution process, and a series of reviews take place. The president ultimately gives the final execute order, and our men and women in uniform perform incredibly on the objective and accomplish their mission. It was arguably a great moment in civil-military relations. Everything worked. It was also a discomforting moment when you think about the history we have of presidents directly picking targets, even brigade commanders directly flying over the objective and exerting command and control. I mean, here you had the president in the sit room watching the raid on live feed TV as it happened with the capability to hear and communicate to the field. Thankfully, the president and none of his advisors got on the radio to tell them anything during the raid, but you could easily imagine a less disciplined president doing so. The Syria use of force debate has also played out in ways that I think are illustrative of how the vertical chain of command works or doesn't in this context, where you have, in this case, military leaders who are experts in their field, responsible for the resources that will go into harm's way, and also stakeholders in the eventual decisions to be made, exerting a very powerful pull on the decision. In the interagency debates and in the decision-making process, I think today's chairman of the Joint Staff has played a role comparable to what Colin Powell played in the late 80s and early 90s, essentially raising the bar for intervention to a point that's so high no president will ever cross that threshold in the near future, or at least absent some direct national threat to the U.S. So there's a whole second category of decisions that I want to talk about briefly, and these are what I call to raise an army decisions. The vertical chain of command plays out here too. When we look at things like the budget, and we look at things like don't ask, don't tell, where the president and Congress, because Congress has constitutional power too, are setting policy for the military, or hiring and firing of senior officers, setting of sexual assault policy, or rewriting the military code of justice, which is, of course, a statute. In all of these contexts, too, we see the vertical chain of command tested by activities of those below, political leadership that doesn't necessarily have the expertise in the domain and has to rely on those below, and a much more complex relationship than we've had, I would argue, until the last few decades. And then the last sort of vertical set of relationships, I think, is it's a political relationship between the president and the military. And I think this is the most dangerous development over the past several years. In the White House today, you have an organization known as Joining Forces. It does enormous good in terms of catalyzing public-private partnerships to serve the veterans and military community. In full disclosure, I had a role in creating this. I've had a role in the president's administration as his Veterans Outreach Director on the 2008 campaign. But this is a public-private partnership in the East Wing, staffed by a blend of military personnel, civilian political appointees, and civil servants that is meant to effectively serve the military and, in some ways, transform them into a constituency or an interest group. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. Similarly, during the campaigns of at least the last 5 presidential cycles, you've seen activity of both sides mobilizing general officers and flag officers for endorsements, enlisting armies of military volunteers to act as field organizers, fundraising from within the military, leveraging recent veterans, and again, I raise my hand guilty here, to act as media surrogates and others. This is dangerous. We should worry about the extent to which the military becomes directly involved in political activity or does so through its proxies. Recently retired officers are indistinguishable in the public eye from currently serving generals, especially if they just got off active duty. And it leads to something even more pernicious, which I think is the transformation of the military itself into an interest group. If the president and Congress treat them that way, they will take on that identity too. And we see some evidence of that, not just in the procurement context where it's always been the case, but also on compensation and benefits and other issues that are playing out today. And I don't know that our democracy will be richer for having a military interest group that is strong and empowered and very active. Okay, second, horizontal civil-military relations. This is really a term that I picked up from a lot of development specialists and diplomats that I used to work with at my old company. CIVMil to them is everything that happens in the field. If you're talking about a provincial reconstruction team, that's CIVMil. If you're talking about the Interagency Counterinsurgency Manual, to them they describe that as CIVMil. It has become a much more important part of U.S. foreign policy over the last 12 years because we've deployed a whole-of-government approach to warfare. And this approach has both borne fruit and had pitfalls in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. Arguably, it's never been better. In Iraq and Afghanistan, service members of all branches, which itself is kind of a miracle of jointness, worked alongside diplomats, development specialists, intelligence officers, agricultural specialists, lawyers, and the list goes on and on, to wage the war against al-Qaeda, to wage the war against insurgents in both of those places. And it happens around the world, whether we're looking at Colombia or Pakistan or Nigeria or the Philippines or other places. It happens everywhere. And it's actually happened before 9/11 as well. Many of you are familiar with Dana Priest's book, The Mission. In this book, she describes how this happened in the 90s when combatant commands and special operations forces were doing much the same thing. I would argue, though, it makes a difference who we send. It may make sense for a lot of reasons to send a special forces team into Pakistan. There, the security calculus matters a bit more, and the unstated message that we're doing development with these guys, but they could easily do force as well, is one we might want to send. But that message plays out more problematically in Mexico or Colombia or sub-Saharan Africa or in other parts of the world where we're not in as much of a direct fight, and we are in a much more direct competition with China and India and other actors in the world, and our military may not be the right foot forward to put for U.S. foreign policy. This is a normative conversation that never happens. This is a conversation that takes place exclusively in the domain of logistics and capacity and security. We talk about, to use the old Civil War general quote, who can get there fastest with the mostest. We don't talk about the normative considerations of why it's right or wrong to send the particular person. It's probably the case that an aircraft carrier will always be first on station for humanitarian disaster, but we need to think about who follows behind. There are larger interactions that also play out in the horizontal domain. We now have what are essentially, if you think about the Defense Department of 1947, it all fit in the Pentagon. You had a military force that had just demobilized from World War II. It had gone from a height of 16 million to a fraction of that, but the military basically fit in the Pentagon, at least its command did, and the Navy annex. Navy. Now that's not true. Now what you've had emerge, and I just use that for illustrative purposes, it's not just about real estate, it's a much richer, more complex, more multipolar organizational chart. Every combatant command, and there are nearly a dozen of them, have an office in Washington, D.C., including a legislative component. Every service has a legislative office staffed by upwards of 40 officers and enlisted personnel, led by a two-star general. Major subordinate agencies like the National Security Agency, JIATO, which is the Joint IED Defeat Organization, and others also maintain their own Washington office. They have their own Washington policy. They have their own budget presentations. They act in the Washington world. And the military, with these agencies, has become much more diffuse. It has many more subordinate actors that in some ways act on their own and act with interests that sometimes run contrary to that of the Defense Department leadership. They also elbow out their civilian peers. And so in this horizontal domain of civil-military relations, you think of the military as the sort of blob that keeps growing, squeezing out everything else, but also becoming much more diffuse and hard to manage. And you see this, I think, play out most sharply in the efficiencies processes of Secretary Gates, Secretary Hagel, whoever comes after Secretary Hagel. They cannot cut effectively because these agencies have become like HAL 9000. You can't pull the plug. Try to pull the plug on JIATO, it comes up with a new mission. We're going to do domestic IED or stuff. try to close us down in the Defense Department? No problem. We're going to move over to DHS or DOJ. They have become interest groups and actors of their own that have a real desire to live on and perpetuate themselves. A lot of folks dismiss horizontal issues as marginal and not important to the fundamental decisions about war and peace, and I think they're wrong. First, I think, as Charlie warned us in his seminal piece, The Origins of the American Military Coup of 2012, we should really worry about an ever-expanding mission set for the military, not because of that first concern I talked about, who we send, but because it's corrosive on the military. We need a military that can fight and win our wars. Charlie, his prose is beautiful, so I do want to quote him a bit. Faced with intractable national problems on one hand and an energetic and capable military on the other, it can be all too seductive to start viewing the military as a cost-effective solution. We made a terrible mistake when we allowed the armed forces to be diverted from its original purpose. Charlie's writing about a prisoner who is essentially shackled up after the coup of 2012, describing how it happened. The prisoner sees a kind of inevitability to the coup amid rising crime, failing schools, a stagnant economy, and a gridlocked political system. The can-do U.S. military stood out in a no-solution society, having remade themselves in the aftermath of Vietnam and emerged from the Gulf War as America's most and perhaps only trusted arm of government. The military soon to become the force of choice for everything. And we start to see that today. And you can see in the military's readiness statistics, you can see it in the global aperture of its basing and its missions, that it is stretched thin. And it does not have to be that way and arguably should not be that way. And we may be crippling ourselves in future conflicts because it's that way. Second, I think, as Dana Priest warned us nearly 20 years ago now, we should be worried for efficiency and efficacy reasons about the extent to which U.S. military activity overwhelms that of other agencies. There are tasks that are, in fact, better suited to other agencies. Yes, we can send a special forces officer or foreign area officer or reconstruction team or civil affairs team to do a lot of what the State Department and USAID does. That doesn't mean they can do it as well. The same is true in the intelligence context. The same is true in the rule of law context. My colleagues like Mark Martins and Jim Crawford and others have done an enormously difficult job in Iraq and Afghanistan building the rule of law of those countries. But I don't know that they would have done as good of a job had we had the capacity to send Justice Department officials or civilian prosecutors or civilian lawyers with experience in commercial litigation. And there's a real normative choice to be made there. Last, there's the issue of the civil-military divide, the broader set of civil-military relations that I think a lot of us are familiar with, but I want to put in sharper relief with a few data points. It's common within the Army to talk about the civil-military divide in terms of America's isn't at war, the Army's at war, or to appropriate the Occupy language. It's the 99%, 1% divide, and the 1% are the 1% who serve in uniform. That statistic is true. 2.4 million men and women serve as active and reserve personnel in the military. When you add in all of state, USAID, the intelligence community, and the Department of Veterans Affairs and their civilians, becomes about 4 million. That's roughly 1.3% of the U.S. population. But articles and memoirs written by young combat veterans and others really put this in a difficult way. They describe a nation that's alien and repulsive in many ways, a nation that's almost unworthy of the sacrifice of the military made over the last 12 years. And I think the apotheosis of this genre may be the suggestion by retired General Stan McChrystal, a legendary combat leader in his own right, but he suggests the nation ought to re-embrace national service and conscription. His remarks hint at a deep desire to share the burdens of military service more broadly in a way not done during his nearly 40-year career, which coincides with the length of the all-volunteer force. But in essence, his response to a society he doesn't recognize is to make it more like the military. I think that's wrong and it's problematic. That said, I think we do have a civ-mil divide, and I think it's likely to grow deeper and wider for a number of reasons. One, the increasing geographical isolation of the military, which results from a gradual shrinkage of the military over time, a shrinkage of its footprint through successive rounds of the Base Closure Commission, and a gradual withdrawal from American cities and population centers to a footprint that is largely rural, largely southern and western, and tied effectively to where the military can get training areas or get easy access to rail lines and seaports and highways. Second are long-term demographic shifts within the veterans population that are megatrends. These are inexorable. They're going to happen. based on the fact that we have a military of the size today and the fact we no longer have conscription, the veterans population is going down. It's going to go down from 22 million today to about 14 million in 2035, and there it's going to hover absent a large increase in the size of the military. It's also becoming radically more diverse, much more dispersed, and much more self-selecting, with dynamics that are very important for the civil divide. The military is becoming far more insular. One illustrative statistic is that a person with military parents is 3 times more likely to join the military than someone without military parents. The military increasingly is a closed society, and its entry barriers, its geographic isolation, its recruiting processes, all of these things make it true. My colleague Dave Barno and I wrote an op-ed in November 2013 where we describe this as almost like a fortress mentality, that the military lives inside the wire. It has its own commissaries, it has its own golf courses, it has its own schools for some large bases. It has its own world. And the longer you stay within that wire, the harder it is actually to transition out. And the military does this for very good reasons, that we need training spaces, we need a separate society that can instill good order and discipline and be effective in combat. We need the types of support organizations that are necessary to support families where you have a service member deployed. But the net effect at the end of that process is to deprive civilians of contact with the military. Civilians can't get onto most military bases anymore. They don't have any opportunities for interaction. And in some ways, this is a self-inflicting wound that continues to hurt the military over and over again in civil military discourse. Another data point that I think gets cited a lot, but it's useful to look at, fewer veterans are represented in elites than ever before. This is mostly a function of demographic facts, but it's also a function of the role of military service in society. The 113th Congress has the lowest number of military members since 1945. 108 members of the 113th Congress, or roughly 20%, have military service. That's overrepresentation as compared to the population, but underrepresentation as compared to previous Congresses. It's been going steadily down. The height was in 1971 and 72, where 390 out of 535 members of Congress had military service. This is the sort of height of the World War II cohort coming in, and that has changed that body's activity, although it's not necessarily the case that Congress does better or worse with military service, but they at least have that visceral understanding. And last is that Americans are deeply conflicted about how they feel about the military. On one hand, you have studies from the Pew Charitable Trust and others that say the military profession includes the people they respect the most, much more so than, I'm sorry, sirs, federal judges, certainly much more than lawyers. And, Congress is probably below the threshold of 0 in that study. No, actually, Congress is at 4%. But the military hovers around 90%. They have an extraordinarily high level of public respect, and that, I think, owes to the performance of the military and its role in society. But increasingly, Americans are skeptical about giving the military resources or doing much for the military. 37% said too much is spent on the military, compared with 28% who think the Pentagon's getting too little. And 32% say it's about right. So, you can lie with statistics as well as you can lie with anything. That says roughly 2/3 think the Pentagon budget is about right or too much. And there's a partisan split on that, which won't surprise you. 51% of Democrats, but only 20% of Republicans believe that too much is spent on the military. There's this sense that, okay, the wars are over, it's now time to beat our swords into plowshares and reap the peace dividend that we've earned. And I think that's going to become increasingly the case over the next few years as we come out of the wars. The nation turns away from the military and also away from the veterans community. And that latter community is one that's going to face a lot of challenges. If the Vietnam and World War II experiences any template, veterans' needs go up after war, not down. The surge in post-traumatic stress and homelessness and other activity for the Vietnam cohort happened in the late 70s and early 80s, not during that conflict. And so today's cohort of veterans includes 2.55 million individual service members who have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. That's a cohort exactly the same size as what served in country in Vietnam. Our needs are going to continue in the years to come. I'm going to close by saying I don't know that any of these issues can be solved, and I want to take the out here and saying, I came here to describe the issues, not to solve them. But I have a few ideas for how to close the gap. One is the military has to be more active here. It is in the military's interest to cross the civil-military divide. If the military is worried about being misused or abused by civil society, then it's incumbent upon itself to engage more politically. There is risk in doing so, but there are ways the military can engage at the community level and the national level that will be constructive. Failing that, it's the constitutional thing to do. The congressional grants of power in the war area contemplate a very rich relationship between the military leadership and Congress, where Congress will be bringing members of the military in to testify regularly, will be soliciting their views, will be taking those into account when they make policy. Similarly, the National Security Act and other statutes also contemplate that rich relationship. And it is in the military's interest to be more active in the political sphere and not just say those issues are policy issues. We're just here to fight America's wars. Second is I think we need to embrace Charlie and his idea that we should render unto the military what is the military's and render unto civilian agencies that which is the military, theirs. Spent too long in the Army, right? But you're listening, which is good. The gradual expansion of the military mission set has corroded the military's capability and will do so more when the military no longer has the resources it had over the last 12 years. We need to focus the military and the profession on what it does well and what we need it to do for the nation. Third, I think we should break the BRAC paradigm. BRAC is the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. We should not close bases simply for reasons of efficiency. We should not build the military footprint simply for that. We should also think about broader concerns of domestic preparedness and civil-military relations. Fourth, I think we need to leverage the reserves more in conjunction with that. The reserve components are almost as large as the active force, and when you include the inactive reserves and the retired reserves, they are actually larger than the active force, and there is a force here that can be leveraged to cross the civil-military divide because these folks live and work among us in a way that our active duty brethren do not. And then last, I think we need to leverage higher education more. Too often the military looks at higher education as just a box to check that, get your master's degree en route to being a colonel. Doesn't matter where you get it. Duke is the same as the University of Phoenix. It's all the same on your officer record brief. Obviously, it's not true. That's wrong. There is real value to sending military personnel, enlisted and officer, to our institutions of higher education so they can learn and also so society can learn from them. The military currently spends nearly $10 billion a year on tuition assistance and scholarships and fellowship programs across the services when you include salaries and other compensation associated with that. That money can be used to foster enormous good. And that's in addition to the roughly $8 to $10 billion a year that the VA spends on GI Bill assistance. We can cross the civil-military divide one classroom at a time and also build a generation of Americans who don't serve in the military but have personal connective tissue by virtue of meeting them in classrooms like this one. So thank you very much for having me down here to talk with you all, and I hope that I was able to spark a few ideas, and I look forward to your questions.
Let me tell you something. I know a little bit about this area. What you just heard is the best exposition of civil-military relations. Number one, the concept of it, but there are more fresh ideas and innovative ideas in that presentation. This is going to be another one of these videos I'm going to make every one of my students watch. I can guarantee you won't see this. And Phil, here's the tasking order. You've got to write on this. We've got to see a white paper coming out of CNAS on this, capturing all those ideas. This is unbelievable. And I think it's because you've been a soldier, you've been in a big law firm, you've been a political appointee, you've run a company, and I think it brings that
I have a hard time keeping a job.
No, it's too many people want it. Anyway, I don't want to take up more. Let's open it up for some Q&A.
So, I'm Butch Bracknell. I'm a career Marine officer. So you're doubtless familiar with the work of Andy Basevich, who sort of describes he's less optimistic about this than you are. I don't want to speak for Dr. Basevich, but if I read him correctly, he sort of describes this CIVMil relationship as more of a hollow relationship, kind of a cheerleading relationship. And I believe he attributes some of it to Vietnam hangover. You addressed it briefly a moment ago, but my question, I guess, is whose responsibility is it to bridge this divide? How do they do it? You talked about the military engaging more proactively. I presume you mean beyond just showing up as a color guard at the Red Sox game, et cetera, but something substantive where there's real understanding being exchanged as opposed to this window dressing of CIVMil. Is my question clear?
Yeah. I think that's a very smart point. There's a terrific Greg Jaffe article in the Washington Post about 2 years ago where he described the ovation given to veterans of the Nationals game in that moment. And it sort of crystallized for me what we were talking about, the kind of thank you for your service moment. When I first came home from Iraq, I really resented that statement. I thought, thank you for your service. Well, to hell with you. What'd you do? And how do you have the credibility to say that? And I think a lot of my peers felt that too. I've come to think, though, that thank you for service is exactly the right response. And I'm grateful for it. I think I'm especially grateful having talked to our Vietnam predecessors and heard about and seen what they went through. But society can do more, and I think there's more on both sides of the ledger. Society can do more in concrete ways like hiring veterans and bringing them into the workforce. It can do a lot more in terms of higher education. There are yellow ribbon programs at a number of higher education institutions like Duke and the University of California that match GI Bill tuition and provide other assistance to vets as they come to campus. I think those are important. And I think that there are other programs, particularly in the business sector, that look to leverage veteran entrepreneurship that are important. But the military has much more to do. I think opening bases more so that civilians and military personnel can interact more is critical. I think reinvigorating fellowships and educational opportunities in a way that couldn't happen during the last 12 years because the military has been fighting and you couldn't take a Marine officer out of the line to send him to school. Those have to restart again. The military also has to engage much better with Congress and the president. They have to be willing to get out there and tell their story in a way that they don't do right now. They frame everything as, well, I'll sort of leave it there. I think particularly the Army needs to do a better job. It's the largest service. It's really fallen down in framing why a nation needs the Army and what the future vision of the Army is. And there's much more on the military side of the ledger that can be done.
Professor Korn.
Thanks for the great presentation. I'm struck by your last comment that the military has to do a better job of getting its story out. Because you think about offices like each service having an Office of Legislative Affairs, military officers whose job it is to basically lobby with legislators. And I remember the effect that General Dunlop's article had when I was a young officer, basically, I think, making the opposite argument that the military after Vietnam became very savvy at the need to be able to interact with legislators, with civilian leaders. So I'm wondering, with all the effort, all the resources that the military puts into this interaction process and all the professional military education that senior leaders get, why should we think that the military needs to do a better job of marketing its value or its function to lawmakers? Is there not a concern that they're already doing too much of that?
There is, and it's a tension. And I think that as you do better in doing public outreach, you have to balance that with the need to not become another interest group and not do damage to the overall fabric of the nation. I think where the military really falls down is in opening itself up and explaining itself to the public. It's not just a messaging thing. I mean, I don't want to frame it as just a messaging thing, but actual engagement. And I come back to this idea that even as a vet, I couldn't get back onto Fort Hood or onto Fort Lewis or onto Fort Campbell to go see my old units because they're all secure installations now. My opportunities for engaging directly with military personnel, if I lived where I used to live in Santa Monica, California, or in other parts of the country, in Manhattan, are just nil. And I think that's a problem. I think the military has to engage with society more broadly. I actually think they're doing quite a bit, as you say, in the halls of Congress and in the Washington ecosystem. But there, I think they need to become more savvy. There is a real sharp line dividing the qualifications and expertise and capabilities of military senior leadership and civilian political leadership. And so a guy like Tom Donilon and a guy like Jim Mattis effectively talk past each other because they've never really engaged over the course of their careers. I think that's a real problem too. As the military develops its senior officers, particularly those that are going to work on the NSS or work in Washington's ecosystem, I think it has to become better at talking to the Susan Rices and Tom Donilons and Stephen Hadleys of the world, and vice versa. That, you know, the Hadleys and the Rices of the world also have to get better at learning about the military, particularly if they don't serve, which statistics tell us very few of them are going to serve going forward.
I really think that's a great answer, and I think part of it, one of the reasons I'm so grateful that we had 38 military personnel come to this conference and we have 52 students here, because I think part of it is engagement in Washington is one thing, but you need to do that personal, and a lot of people have never met anybody in the military. Here at Duke, there's 14,000 students, but there's only 143 veterans among the students. Anyway, let's see, wow.
Hey, good morning. My name is Ian Darrow. I'm a student here at the law school. I'm also a platoon commander of the Marine Corps Reserve. You talked about mission creep and trying to render unto the civilian agencies what is theirs. I'm thinking about kind of the perspective of a lieutenant or a captain who's on the ground, who's trying to conduct counterinsurgency operations, who might be responsible for a couple hundred square miles. I don't think it's necessarily easy for that junior officer to separate, you know, charging the hill with conducting economic policy or trying to give aid to the people he's interacting with or conducting politics. So I'm wondering, can you get a little bit more concrete about how to bring civilian agencies in a way that's meaningful and that helps that officer, you know, complete his or her mission?
I think it's a terrific question, and it reminds me of my own experience in Iraq working with police and courts and special operations forces, where I don't know that I was the right person to do that job. I think we're going to come out of these wars, and it's going to take a while because we're still very emotionally close to them, but we're going to question the wisdom of relying on young Marine lieutenants like you and young Army captains like me to do those jobs. I think there's a clarifying focus that needs to happen in the next few years, where we refocus the military on the tasks that the military must do, because those are hard enough. You know, being an infantry officer or being a civil affairs officer is hard enough in of itself, let alone having to also be an agricultural specialist, development specialist, rule of law specialist, et cetera. And I think that the answer here is to clarify and focus the military and to bring those other agencies in by developing their capability, giving them deployment capabilities, whether they're leased or procured, and finding ways that we can rely on all of the elements of national power and not just the military and stretching the military too broadly.
Yeah, Phil and I have talked about this before, because we also have to think, what do these other countries, especially less developed countries, see when it's a guy in a uniform who's making things happen, whether in the economic realm, the political realm?
And there's another argument that we've had, and I'm sorry to take another minute, but our comparative advantage as a nation is not doing what's essentially imperial state building. Our comparative advantage as a nation is the military, is the American way of war, which has developed over the 20th century, now the 21st century, and can apply power in very direct and also in very nuanced ways. And I think we run great risk if we try to be a colonial power, and that may not be the best modality for us to pursue strategically. And in a very concrete way, if we build a military capable of doing that and only that, I think we're going to inevitably tack towards those missions, which may not be in our long-term interest.
And we shouldn't have the face of America, the military. Unfortunately, we have maybe one or two more questions. John?
Oh, I'm sorry. Was your name John, too?
No.
Sorry.
And, sir, we will take at least your question, too, after
Thank you,
Mr. Duncan's.
Yes, I was Special Ops Vietnam and now then became a lawyer. General Dunlap and I were in JAG school together. But my question is this, too. You were talking about not being so in favor of redoing the draft. So I wanted you to further elaborate on that. But my other point is, I've taught overseas since I've been a lawyer for schools like University of Oklahoma, and I've noticed there that they overemphasize Fox News and don't even have MSNBC. And I think that hurts somewhat, too, in terms of bringing more people to have knowledge and those in the military. I think that, too, could be looked at more so in terms of what the military is fed. So if you could respond to that, please.
Sure. Do we want to have Bob take the mic as well and do
Yeah,
both at the same time?
why don't we get both questions, if you could give it, and then Bill can.
My name is Bob Lynch. I'm a retired civilian. My qualifier for being here, for better or worse, I come from a family of Marines, lawyers, and an FBI agent. I'm the only civilian in the family among 9 people. Anyway, I'd like you to address a question, make some comments on the soldiers openly gay soldiers serving in the military. I mean, the civilians, look at the NFL. They've all reverted to 12-year-olds. They're worried about the shower, what's going to happen in the locker room. Now, the military, whatever their motivations were, it was an order. It was clean. It was efficient. I haven't heard a peep. It's been, what, a year and a half since about it.
Those are 2 great questions.
Yeah, so
first on the
one
draft.
last quick thing. The genius is not in the NFL. Maybe they could consult the military. Is that even?
So two great questions on the draft. With apologies to Jay-Z, I wrote a column, 99 problems, but a draft isn't one. I think that the ultimate argument against conscription is an economics one, that we simply don't need that much military manpower. The cohort of 18 to 25-year-olds in America is about 30 or 40 million. We don't need a military that size. If you don't take that many folks in the force, you have to have some selection mechanism. We have a horrible history of developing equitable selection mechanisms, whether it's a lottery or whether it's a set of exemptions or anything else. And I think that it would do more harm than good. It would also do harm if we were to use conscripts to do other tasks in America, building roads, working in hospitals, teaching in schools. That would destroy the labor markets in those fields and I think do much more harm than good. And that's before we get to questions about a professionalized military or not. I think the economics alone is why I'd say no. Your second question on news media, I think is a salient one, but I would point to some of the political surveys that have been done in the military that actually show today's military is a pretty good reflection of America. There may be pockets of, Fox News watching, hyper-conservative folks in the military, but there are also equally liberal pockets too, and I think it's particularly true when you look at the enlisted population. The military is incredibly diverse. The demographic diversity also begets political diversity, and today's military is much more politically diverse than the veterans community. The median veteran in America is a 64-year-old white male. By demographic reasons, the veterans community is therefore somewhat conservative. Today's active military looks nothing like that and is much more diverse. With respect to gays in the military, I think this is an enormous success story, and it owes to the professionalism of the military and also the fact that gays had always been there. They'd been serving quietly, but in ways that were often known to their comrades. And you now have 12 years of war and a military that knows what matters, and to use a bit of pejorative, what's chicken shit, and
Legal term.
Doctrinal term. And so this has just been a non-issue, and the services have also taken as a point of pride, no pun intended, that they will make this a success, and that they will do it because it's a matter of keeping faith with the troops. I wish, frankly, they could do this with sexual assault in the military. I wish they could find it in themselves to lead the way on that issue as they have on gays in the military.
Phil, I wish we had more time, but please take it as a huge compliment that I broke my own iron rule and we spent 4 extra minutes on your presentation. Phil will be around during the break. Please be back in your seats at 09:30 sharp. Thank you.